Before the first cities rose from the marshlands, before the first laws were carved into stone, there was a land cradled between two great rivers, where gods walked among mortals and shaped the course of history. In the heart of ancient Sumer, two divine brothers stood above all others: Enki, the wise lord of the deep waters, and Enlil, the mighty ruler of the winds and destinies. They were allies and rivals, creators and enforcers, bound together by blood yet forever divided in vision. Their story is not only one of ancient temples and forgotten kings, it is the story of the balance between compassion and authority, between change and stability, a story that has echoed for thousands of years. Tonight, we will follow that story, from the first shaping of the world to the fading light of Sumer's last days, as the voices of Enki and Enlil whisper once more, across the waters and the winds. In the beginning, before the cities of Sumer rose from the mud of the great rivers, the world was still in the hands of the gods. Among these divine beings, two brothers would shape the fate of humanity more than any others. Enki, lord of the fresh waters, wisdom, and creation, and Enlil, god of the wind, storms, and kingship. They were not equals in temperament nor in vision. Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian, was cunning, gentle, and a master of craft and knowledge. He saw potential in humans and often acted as their protector. Enlil, on the other hand, was strict, commanding, and held firmly to the divine order, seeing humans as servants of the gods. Together, they embodied two forces that would forever pull at the destiny of mankind: creation and control, compassion and authority. The Sumerians told that before the land was divided into cities, the gods dwelled together. Their home was in the distant heavens, but they descended to earth to rule over it directly. Enki's domain was the Absu, the deep waters beneath the earth from which life springs. His temple in the city of Eridu was said to be the first ever built, a place where the sweet waters rose and the first fields were watered. Enlil's power, however, resided in Nippur, in the Ikur temple, the mountain house, where decrees of fate were issued. According to the ancient tablets, it was Enlil who separated heaven from earth, establishing the realms for gods and mortals. His was the power to command storms, to grant kingship, and to decree destiny. Yet, as his influence grew, so too did the friction between him and his younger brother. Enki often defied him, offering aid to humans when Enlil's punishments were too harsh, or using his wisdom to alter decrees that he saw as unjust. The origins of their rivalry go back to the very shaping of the world. The mother goddess Namu, from the primordial waters, birthed An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. From them came Enlil, the force that separated the two, allowing life to flourish. Enki, though, inherited his mother's connection to the deep waters and the mysteries hidden there. While Enlil's role was to govern and maintain order, Enki's was to innovate and transform. This difference in purpose would make them both indispensable and eternally at odds. The earliest myths hint that even the creation of humanity itself was a point of tension between them. The gods, burdened by the toil of tending the land, needed workers. Enlil wanted obedient laborers who would serve without question. Enki, however, envisioned beings who could think, learn, and perhaps one day share in the gods' knowledge. To craft such creatures was no simple task. It required both the raw clay of the earth and the divine essence of the gods. This act of creation would bind the fate of humanity to the will of these two brothers forever. It is in the stories of the first cities that we begin to see how their rivalry shaped Sumer. Enki, with his gifts of irrigation, agriculture, and craftsmanship, raised up Eridu into a shining example of civilization. Enlil, in turn, gave Nippur its authority and made it the heart of divine rule. Other gods took sides, for in the assembly of the Anunnaki, alliances mattered as much as power. Humanity stood in the middle of this divine contest, too not always aware that their kings, their floods, their very laws were echoes of a struggle between two immortal wills. Even in these earliest days, when the world was young and the clay of the first cities still damp, the seeds of conflict were already sown. For while Enki sought to guide and uplift, Enlil guarded the line between God and man, and in Sumer, that line would be crossed more than once. The creation of humanity, as told in the Enuma Elish and other Sumerian Akkadian myths, was not an act of pure generosity. It was born out of necessity. The lesser gods, the Igigi, had grown weary of digging canals, planting fields, and maintaining the cities. They labored under Enlil's decrees, but their patience wore thin. Whispers of rebellion reached the high gods. In council, the decision was made that a new race must be created to bear the burden of work. Here, Enki's role became essential. Known for his unmatched wisdom and understanding of the forces of life, he proposed a daring plan. From the clay of the earth, infused with the divine blood of a slain god, new beings would be shaped. These would not be mere animals. They would be capable of learning, of speaking, of understanding commands. In the temple of Eridu, Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag worked side by side, forming the first humans. Their fingers pressed the soft clay. Their incantations breathed life into the forms, and the waters of the Abzu ran through their veins. When the first humans awoke, they were frail, confused, and awestruck by the towering gods around them. Yet, in time, they began to understand their tasks. Tending the fields, raising the livestock, and serving in the temples, Enlil was satisfied. The work was done, the rebellion of the Igigi quelled. But Enki saw something more. He watched as humans learned to speak in their own tongues, to fashion tools, to pass on knowledge. To him, these were not just servants, but children in need of guidance. This difference in perspective would be the root of many conflicts. Enlil believed humans should remain in their place, fulfilling the role they were created for. Enki believed in giving them the means to survive and prosper, even if it meant they might one day rival the gods in skill. Over the centuries, this quiet disagreement grew into open defiance. Whenever Enlil sought to punish mankind, Enki would find a way to soften the blow. Whenever Enki gifted knowledge, Enlil would try to limit its spread. The ancient tablets tell of a time when the gods decreed that humanity's growing numbers were too great. Enlil, disturbed by the noise of their cities and their constant pleas, decided to send plagues, droughts, and famine to reduce their numbers. Yet, in secret, Enki whispered warnings to the humans he favored. He taught them how to dig wells during drought, how to store grain against famine, and how to heal the sick. Enlil's punishments were blunted, and humanity endured. It was not the first time Enki would act against his brother's will, nor would it be the last. For on the horizon loomed a far greater catastrophe, one that would test the loyalty of the gods, the resilience of humanity, and the very bond between these two divine brothers. The great catastrophe that would forever mark the rivalry of Enki and Enlil came in the form of a flood. The Sumerians told of a time when the gods themselves decided that humanity must be swept away. The reasons vary in the surviving tablets. Some say Enlil was angered by the growing clamor of human voices, disturbing his rest. Others say humanity had grown arrogant, encroaching upon the sacred spaces of the gods. Whatever the cause, Enlil called the divine assembly and persuaded them to unleash the waters. The decision was made in secret. Bound by the oath of the gods, Enki was forbidden to warn mankind directly. Yet his heart could not accept their annihilation. So he devised a plan that skirted the letter of the law while breaking its spirit. He summoned Atrahasis, a wise and faithful man, not in person, but through a reed wall. Speaking to the wall, knowing Atrahasis could hear, he gave instructions to build a great boat. The vessel was to be sealed with pitch, stocked with food and animals, and made ready before the coming storm. When the appointed time came, the skies grew black, the winds screamed, and the subterranean waters burst forth. For 7 days and 7 nights, The floodwaters raged. Cities vanished beneath the waves, fields and temples alike swallowed by the sea. The Anunnaki themselves trembled at the destruction. Even Enlil, watching from the heavens, felt a pang of regret. When the waters receded, Atrahasis emerged from his boat and offered sacrifices. The sweet smell rose to the heavens, drawing the gods who had been deprived of offerings during the flood. It was then that Enlil saw the survivors. His anger flared, but Enki stood before him, unashamed. He argued that destroying all mankind was not justice. Let plagues or wild beasts thin their numbers if necessary, but let life endure. Reluctantly, Enlil agreed, and the flood became a memory etched in the heart of humanity. Yet from that day forward, a deep mistrust colored their every dealing. Enlil saw in Enki's actions not just compassion, but defiance. Enki, for his part, saw in Enlil's decrees a coldness that could too easily turn to cruelty. And between them stood humanity, shaped by both brothers' hands, caught in the currents of their eternal struggle. In the centuries after the flood, the first great dynasties of Sumer arose. Kingship, the Sumerians said, descended from heaven. Each city-state had its patron deity, and in the cosmic hierarchy, Enlil remained the supreme authority. His temple at Nippur was the axis of the world, where divine decrees were issued and destinies fixed. Rulers from Ur, Lagash, and Uruk all sought his blessing to legitimize their reigns. Enki, however, worked in subtler ways. In his city of Eridu, far to the south, he spread the arts of civilization. It was here that the divine laws and attributes of culture, were kept. These were not just rules, but the very essence of society. Kingship, truth, music, weaving, craftsmanship, even emotions like joy and fear. In one famous tale, Inanna, goddess of love and war, sought to acquire these gifts for her city of Uruk. She visited Enki, who welcomed her with a banquet and, after too much beer, agreed to give her the me. When Enki awoke and realized what he had done, he sent his servants to retrieve them. But Inanna reached Uruk before they could catch her. Though frustrated, Enki did not rescind the gifts. In this way, culture spread beyond his own domain, enriching humanity, but also shifting power between the cities. Enlil, ever protective of the cosmic order, saw such transfers as dangerous, for they could upset the balance among the gods. This tension was not merely about cities and temples, it was about the nature of power itself. Enlil's authority was vertical, descending from heaven in an unbroken line. Enki's was lateral, flowing through rivers of knowledge and exchange. One sought to command, the other to persuade. And so the history of Sumer became a tapestry woven from both threads, its brilliance born of the friction between them. The myths also tell of darker episodes, where the rivalry between Enki and Enlil had devastating consequences. One such tale concerns the city of Akkad, whose king Naram-Sin defied the will of Enlil. When Enlil withdrew his favor, famine and rebellion followed. The king, in desperation, attacked Enlil's temple, an act that shocked even the other gods. Enki, though no friend to such sacrilege, saw the destruction that would follow if divine wrath went unchecked. He tried to intercede, suggesting that the punishment be measured, that a path to restoration remain open. But Enlil's decision was firm. Akkad fell, its people scattered, its glory reduced to dust. For Enlil, it was a necessary act to preserve divine authority. For Enki, it was a tragedy that might have been avoided with mercy. This pattern repeated over the ages. Enlil's judgments were swift and absolute, aimed at protecting the sacred order. Enki's interventions, often secretive, sought to temper them, to preserve life and possibility. Each saw the other as undermining his purpose. Enlil viewed Enki as a disruptor, too willing to bend rules for his favorites. Enki viewed Enlil as inflexible, blind to the costs of his decrees. And the humans, those clay-born children of the gods, lived in the shifting space between these visions, thriving or suffering according to which God's will prevailed in a given age. After the fall of Akkad, the cities of Sumer learned a harsh lesson. The favor of the gods was as essential as the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Kings and priests grew even more careful to honor Enlil at Nippur, for his decrees could make or unmake empires. Yet, in the quiet southern city of Eridu, Enki's influence remained steady. Here, the Abzu still bubbled with fresh water, and the temple's scribes continued to record the secrets of agriculture, building, and healing. To the people, Enki's gifts were tangible: a well-dug canal, a remedy for a fever, a new method for baking bread, while Enlil's blessings were more distant, bound up in the lofty notion of cosmic order. Despite their differences, the brothers still met in the great assemblies of the Anunnaki. These gatherings, held in the celestial realms or in the sacred spaces of Earth, were where the fates of nations were discussed. Enlil would speak first, his voice carrying the authority of the highest office, and he would lay out the laws or punishments he deemed necessary. Enki would follow, often praising his brother's wisdom, before suggesting small alterations that, in practice, might change the entire outcome. It was a subtle dance, neither open rebellion nor complete submission. There were times, however, when Enki acted without the assembly's approval. One such moment came during a terrible drought. Enlil had decreed that the lack of rain was a punishment for human arrogance, and it would not end until the people returned to proper reverence. Enki, watching crops wither and herds die, sent forth underground waters to nourish certain fields. It was a quiet rebellion, one the people whispered about in gratitude, but dared not proclaim openly. Enlil, of course, knew he always knew, but confronting Enki directly often meant admitting that his own decrees could be softened. In myth, these acts of mercy are told with reverence for Enki's compassion, but they also show the deeper truth. The gods themselves were bound by differing visions of justice. To Enlil, justice meant maintaining the structure of creation, even at the cost of suffering. To Enki, it meant preserving life, even at the cost of bending divine law. This difference would continue to shape Sumer's destiny for generations, as every flood, famine, or war became a canvas for their contest. Among the most fascinating stories that reveal their rivalry is the tale of the Mi, those divine decrees that shape civilization itself. The Mi were said to be held by Enki in Eridu, locked away in the depths of the Abzu. They were not physical objects in the modern sense, but tablets, symbols, and forces that defined aspects of culture, leadership, craftsmanship, justice, love, war, music, even despair. Without them, no city could truly flourish. Inanna, the ambitious goddess of Uruk, desired these gifts for her people. She visited Enki under the guise of friendship, and he welcomed her with a grand feast. They drank the sacred beer, and in his inebriated generosity, Enki granted her the Mi. Inanna departed quickly, loading her boat with the divine decrees and sailing for Uruk. When Enki sobered, he realized what he had done. He dispatched his servants to stop her, sending creatures of the deep to retrieve the boat. Yet each time, Inanna evaded capture, finally reaching Uruk with the Mi safely in her possession. What is striking in this myth is that, though Enki could have demanded their return, he did not. He allowed Uruk to keep the gifts, perhaps recognizing that civilization should not be the treasure of one city alone. Enlil, however, saw danger. The spread of the Mi could lead to competition, disorder, and challenges to divine authority. To him, each city's power had to be carefully balanced, lest one dominate all others. This difference in outlook is a microcosm of their rivalry. Enki saw knowledge as a river; it should flow freely, nourishing all who drink from it. Enlil saw it as a reservoir, controlled by gates, released only when it served the greater stability of the divine plan. The tension between these philosophies did not just play out among the gods. It echoed in the politics of kings and priests, in the trade of goods, in the writing of laws. In the quiet hours of the night, when the temples were still and the stars shone over the floodplains, Perhaps even the brothers themselves wondered if their visions could ever truly be reconciled. But the myths suggest they knew the truth, that the push and pull between them was not a flaw, but the very engine of history in the lands between the rivers. The story of Inanna's descent into the underworld reveals more of the hidden geometry between the brothers. Inanna, luminous queen of heaven and Uruk, sought to expand her dominion into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. She clothed herself in 7 sacred adornments and passed through 7 gates, each gate demanding one item, until she stood naked before the throne of the dead. Judgment fell upon her, and she was struck down, hung like a lifeless thing upon a hook. With the goddess of love imprisoned, fertility withered across the land. Fields grew pale. Animals ceased their mating calls. Songs in the temples fell to a hush that even the river winds would not disturb. No prayer reached Enlil that moved him to break the laws of realms. The order he guarded was precise. The living and the dead must remain apart. Trespass must have consequence. Yet Enki, far in Eridu, perceived the world's heartbeat falter. He did not storm the gates with thunder or demand a reversal of sentence. He crafted a solution from empathy and cunning. From the dirt beneath his fingernails and the pure waters of the Abzu, he fashioned 2 tiny beings, neither male nor female, the Kurgara and the Galatur. He armed them not with spears, but with knowledge, with the power to speak the right words at the right moment, to mirror lament with lament, to comfort Ereshkigal's unspeakable grief. When they entered the dark halls and echoed the queen's cries, Ereshkigal offered them a gift. They asked for the suspended body of Inanna, a small request that unfastened the knot of death. Enki had also placed in their hands the food and water of life. With these, they restored Inanna, who rose as morning rises from the edge of the marshes. But the underworld demanded balance. A substitute must descend if Inanna would return. Thus began the sorrowful search that ended with Dumuzi, the shepherd king, whose turning of seasons would henceforth mark the dying and the greening of the earth. This rescue did not overturn order. It reinterpreted it, threading mercy through the weave. Enlil saw that the boundary had been respected even as life was restored. Enki had not shattered law. He found a gentle hinge within it. The priests of Nippur would later say that such interventions were permissible only because fate is layered like clay. One layer sets, and another is smoothed upon it. Inanna's tale became a parable whispered among scribes and singers, that wisdom, properly spoken, can loosen the cords that bind without tearing the fabric of the cosmos. In the wake of these events, the cities resumed their rhythms. Barges heavy with reeds slid along the canals. Ovens brightened with new loaves. Flutes and lyres returned to courtyards. Yet, a question lingered in the minds of kings and commoners alike. How far would Enki go to aid the living? And how firm would Enlil stand when compassion threatened precedent? Temples offered both rain prayers to Enlil and well rituals to Enki, acknowledging that survival in Sumer was a duet. Skies must open, but so must the springs. In private councils, the brothers' glances were measured. Enlil understood that Enki's artful rescue had prevented collapse. Offerings would have ceased had the land remained barren. Enki, in turn, did not boast. He knew that without Enlil's axis, the heavens might tilt. That civilization needs both the grammar of law and the poetry of grace. Between them, the tablet of destinies remained a sacred symbol, sometimes said to rest with Enlil in Ikur, sometimes to be consulted by Enki in his watery chambers, always reminding the assembly that decree and counsel are twins who must hold hands if the world is to keep its balance. Another legend circles the same theme from a different shore. The story of Adapa, the wise man of Eridu. Adapa was Enki's devotee, a fisherman and priest whose days began before dawn when the east wind still combed the reeds. He learned from Enki how to bake bricks true, how to recite the purifying words, how to keep the nets from tangling. One day, the south wind rose and overturned his boat. In anger, Adapa uttered enchantments taught by his master and broke the wind's wings. The world stilled, but the offense rose to heaven. Anu summoned Adapa to answer for this act. Enki, protective as ever, prepared his servant for the perilous audience. He dressed him in mourning garments and taught him how to speak so that the celestial court would be softened. But he also warned him. What he also warned him: do not eat the bread they offer. Do not drink the water they set before you, for it is the bread and water of death. Adapa obeyed. When he stood before Anu, the great father was surprised by the mortal's wisdom and grief-clad humility. Moved, Anu ordered the bread of life and the water of life to be brought, a gesture that would have made Adapa immortal. Yet Adapa refused, faithful to Enki's caution, and immortality passed him by like a cool wind that never quite reached the skin. Scribes debated this mystery by lamplight for generations. Did Enki, in shielding his servant, misread the turn in heaven's will? Or did he preserve a boundary that must not be crossed? Some said Enki foresaw a cost humanity could not bear, that becoming deathless would demand a price deeper than comfort or law. Others whispered that Enlil's silent presence in the court held the line, that kingship on earth must be mortal to keep the temples supplied with the urgency of prayer. Whatever the truth, the outcome shaped the human condition. Wisdom was granted, immortality withheld. The city learned to love, skill, and memory, to build archives of clay so that words could live where bodies could not. From this paradox rose the craft of scribes, the hum of schools where boys practiced signs until their wrists ached. Tablets of accounting, hymns, and contracts multiplied in the shadow of ziggurats. Enki's gift of understanding prospered in every mark pressed by the reed stylus, while Enlil's order lent those marks authority. A contract meant something because heaven backed it. In each case woven, in each boundary stone set, the brothers' rivalry became cooperation in disguise. Adapa's tale circulated among fishermen mending nets and princes sipping beer from clear stone cups. It taught that advice, even divine advice, encounters moments when fate turns its face unexpectedly, that obedience can save a man and still cost him what he did not know he was offered. It taught that the gods themselves move within a web of purposes. Enki's kindness, Enlil's guardianship, Anu's far-seeing balance. And for the people on the banks of the twin rivers, it framed life not as punishment, but as apprenticeship, a long schooling in which each flood season, each drought, each harvest becomes a lesson in reading the sky and the soil together. Evenings in Eridu, priests would pour sweet water into basins and invoke the Abzu, while in Nippur, incense rose in straight columns, as if the smoke itself wished to be a law. Travelers moving between the cities carried both prayers in their packs. They sought success not from one brother against the other, but from the harmony that occasionally surfaced when wisdom and authority looked upon the same field and agreed. Let this prosper. Let this endure. And though the world did not grant men the life of the undying, it granted them memory, which, preserved on clay and in song, can cross centuries the way a barge crosses a calm canal under the pale, attentive moon. There is an older layer of the tradition, preserved in fragments, that speaks of the time before Enki and Enlil's rivalry was defined, when both labored together to shape the world from the mingled waters and the raw earth. In these shadowed accounts, the brothers were not yet symbols of opposing philosophies, but craftsmen of the same grand work. The mountains were raised like the edges of a divine kiln. Rivers poured into their beds, and the first animals were placed in the marshes. In these days, Enki shaped fish and birds, giving each its patterns and calls, while Enlil measured the winds that would carry seed and pollen across the field. But cooperation is rarely without subtle tensions. Even in the myths that show them as united, their differences gleam like mica in the clay. Enlil's work was clean, ordered, and set in straight lines. The levees and canals he marked out followed the logic of the stars. Enki's designs curved like the reeds that swayed in the breeze. His channels wandered into unexpected pools, creating marshlands alive with frogs and wading birds. Farmers blessed by Enlil's plan found steady irrigation, while those who depended on Enki's winding waters learned adaptability. It is perhaps here, in the shaping of land and water, that their divergence first took root, one seeking the enduring stability of the measured path, the other embracing the fertile unpredictability of the meandering flow. The people of Sumer would later inherit both approaches. In their fields, they built straight canals lined with bricks, but they also left side channels to spill into the wild marshes where fish and waterfowl thrived. In governance, they recorded strict laws, but they also told tales that taught cunning and flexibility. This was the double inheritance of Enki and Enlil, one that ensured the civilization could both endure and adapt. In the sacred hymns, the priests spoke of a great assembly of the gods in those early days, when destinies were assigned to each deity. Enlil was given kingship over the earth's surface, the power to grant authority to rulers. Enki received dominion over the hidden places, the depths of the Abzu, the mysteries beneath the soil, the secrets of craft and sorcery. This division was not a rupture but a balance, though it would one day harden into rivalry. For now, the brothers returned to their cities, each building a temple that mirrored his domain. In Nippur, Ikur rose like a mountain against the sky. In Eridu, Abzu shimmered above the waters. Its foundations sunk deep into the life-giving spring. The Sumerians would remember this age as a time when the earth was still young, the gods still close, and the brothers still willing to walk the same road. Yet even then, in the eyes of those who listened closely, the seeds of future conflict were visible, carried in the wind and in the currents of the deep. As centuries passed, the division between their roles grew more defined. Enlil's authority became ever more associated with kingship and law. No ruler could claim the throne without the blessing of Nippur, and the great festivals drew kings from every city to reaffirm their loyalty. Enki's influence, though less ceremonial, was equally vital. His gifts were woven into daily life. A farmer plowing his field, a potter shaping clay, a healer mixing herbs, all were heirs to the arts he had bestowed. The political life of Sumer reflected this duality. Nippur was the heart of spiritual authority, but Eridu was a source of innovation. From Eridu's scribal schools came new ways of recording transactions, new forms of poetry, and new techniques for metallurgy. These innovations spread along the trade routes, changing the balance of power between cities. In times of harmony, Enlil's order and Enki's creativity complemented one another, producing eras of prosperity. But in times of tension, the same dynamics could spark conflict. As conservative forces resisted the disruptions of change, and innovators chafed at rigid decrees. One story tells of a dispute over a boundary between the lands of Nippur and Eridu. The river that marked the border had shifted its course over decades, eroding one bank and depositing soil on the other. Enlil's priests claimed that the boundary was fixed by divine decree and should remain where it had been marked, regardless of the river's path. Enki's followers argued that the river was alive, and its movements were part of nature's design. The disagreement escalated into a standoff, with offerings to both temples doubling as the cities prepared for possible war. In the end, the assembly of gods intervened, crafting a compromise that blended both views. The old boundary would be respected in official records, but the land newly formed by the river's shift would be shared for farming. This outcome bore the mark of both brothers. It honored the permanence of decree while acknowledging the living, changing world. Such resolutions were rare but cherished, for they reminded the people that the gods could, when they chose, speak with one voice. Yet beneath the formal peace, the rivalry continued, shaping not only the destiny of cities but the worldview of an entire civilization. That life itself was a balance between the set and the shifting, the fixed star and the flowing current, the mountain's root and the spring's wandering song. The tale of the lost me speaks again to the restless exchange between the brothers' domains. Long after Inanna had carried the me to Uruk, the cities of Sumer continued to vie for cultural primacy. Enlil's priests watched the growth of Uruk with measured suspicion, aware that its expanding influence could challenge Nippur's central place in the divine order. Enki, however, seemed untroubled. In his view, the spread of civilization's gifts strengthened humanity and, by extension, the gods themselves. One festival season, a delegation from Uruk traveled south to Eridu to offer thanks to Enki for the me. They brought fine woven garments, jars of honeyed beer, and carved ivory from distant lands. The temple courtyard filled with music and dancing, and Enki emerged from the Abzu hall to bless the visitors. His blessing was more than ceremonial. It was said that he spoke words that rekindled the power of the me in Uruk's keeping, ensuring their continued vitality. When word reached Nippur, Enlil called a private council. He did not accuse Enki openly, but his words carried an edge. The me were the foundation of order, and to renew their power without the assembly's consent was, in Enlil's view, a breach of divine process. Enki replied calmly that the gifts were not locked away for the pride of one city or one god. Their purpose was to keep the lands thriving, and neglecting them for the sake of protocol would harm all. The exchange did not end in open conflict, but the air between the brothers thickened. Priests in both cities began to interpret omens in the flight of birds and the flow of water, looking for signs of divine disagreement. Farmers and merchants went about their work, but they sensed the tension. In Sumer, the health of the land was bound not only to the rivers and the rains, but to the unseen accord of the gods who governed them. That year, the barley harvest was uneven. Some regions yielded abundantly, while others suffered blight. The priests debated whether this was the will of Enlil, the mood of Enki, or the natural ebb and flow of the earth. For the people, it was a reminder that the divine was not a single voice but a dialogue, sometimes harmonious, sometimes discordant, in which their lives were the verses. One of the most enduring myths that illuminates the brothers' relationship is the saga of Ninurta, Enlil's son. Ninurta was a warrior and a champion of order, devoted to defending the boundaries set by his father. When the monstrous demon Asag arose, threatening to shatter the mountains and poison the rivers, it was Ninurta who took up arms. He wielded a great mace and led the charge against the chaos creature, scattering its stony offspring across the land. Enlil's joy at his son's victory was immense, but the battle had altered the land's balance. The mountains wept streams of water where the rocks had been shattered, and new fertile valleys appeared. Enki, seeing opportunity in this transformation, moved quickly to guide the floodwaters into irrigation channels. To him, Asag's defeat was not just a restoration of order, but a chance for renewal. In some tellings, Enlil approved of this cooperation. In others, he chastised Enki for turning a military victory into a pretext for change that had not been decreed. The tension here mirrors many other moments in their shared myth, the same event, seen through two lenses. One focused on preserving what was, the other on shaping what could be. The story of Ninurta also revealed how the next generation of gods inherited the brothers' duality. Ninurta's respect for his father's authority was tempered by a grudging admiration for Enki's ingenuity. When he built new canals or reinforced levees in the wake of battle, the designs often bore Enki's influence. It is said that in the quiet after the battle with Asag, Ninurta walked alone along the fresh waterways, tracing their bends with his hand, and wondering if perhaps the old rivalry was less a flaw of the divine order and more its secret strength. For the mortals who heard this tale in the glow of oil lamps, it was a reminder that conflict between powers need not end in ruin. If warriors and builders, lawgivers and innovators could each leave their mark, then even the gods' disputes could yield bounty. And so the people of Sumer continued to live in the space between storm and spring, between decree and dream. The rhythm of Sumerian life itself seemed to mirror the two brothers' eternal balance. Planting and harvest followed the cycles of the rivers, a gift of both the skies Enlil commanded and the underground waters Enki guarded. The New Year festivals honored this duality, blending rites for rain and wind, with rituals for springs and fertile soil. In Nippur, priests recited Enlil's decrees for the coming year, while in Eridu, offerings were cast into the Abzu to ensure the hidden waters continued their quiet labor beneath the fields. One year, an unusually long dry season, set the stage for another of their legendary disagreements. Enlil's priests declared that the drought was the result of neglected offerings and lax temple discipline. They urged the king to enforce stricter religious observance, to realign the people with the will of heaven. Enki's followers, however, saw the problem differently. To them, the drought was not punishment but a natural challenge, one that could be met with ingenuity, new wells, deeper canals, and better water storage. The king, caught between the two visions, tried to honor both. He organized grand processions to Nippur, filling the streets with incense and song, while also commissioning engineers from Eridu to begin digging a network of reservoirs. In the mythic retelling, the work crews were blessed by Enki, who sent cool breezes at night to ease their labor, while the processions in Nippur were accompanied by unexpected gusts of wind, a sign of Enlil's presence. By the year's end, the rains returned. The reservoirs brimmed, and both priesthoods claimed the outcome as proof of their god's favor. The people saw it more simply. Without the ceremonies, perhaps the skies would not have opened. Without the reservoirs, perhaps the fields would still have withered. Life in Sumer was an unending lesson that survival lay not in choosing between the brothers, but in honoring both. And though their rivalry could flare into sharp disagreement, it also ensured that every problem was met with two solutions, each strengthening the other in ways neither might fully admit. The Sumerian king list, a text carved in the steady hand of scribes, quietly reflects the brothers' alternating influence. Kingship was said to descend from heaven, but its seat shifted from city to city over the centuries, sometimes resting in Nippur's orbit, other times near Eridu's sphere. Periods of strict central authority alternated with times of flourishing innovation, as though the invisible pendulum between Enlil's order and Enki's creativity swung over the land. One striking example comes from the reign of a king who, according to legend, sought to build a new kind of city, one that blended the straight lines of Nippur's planned streets with the flowing canals of Eridu's marsh-bound neighborhoods. He invited architects from both traditions, and for a time the city thrived. But the harmony did not last. A dispute arose over the city's laws. Enlil's priests argued for rigid codes carved into stone, immutable as the stars, while Enki's advisors urged for flexible statutes that could adapt to circumstance. The debate reached the king himself, and the myths say he dreamed of standing on a high wall overlooking the city. On one side, streets stretched in perfect grids. On the other, waterways curled like sleeping serpents. In the dream, both sides began to fade, until only the meeting place between them remained bright. Taking this as an omen, he decreed that the city would keep its laws in two forms, one carved in stone for the great principles, and another kept on clay tablets that could be amended by the council. Though the experiment was not without friction, it became a model for other cities. Merchants praised its adaptability in trade disputes, while farmers valued the security of fixed water rights. Priests from Nippur and Eridu both claimed credit for the king's wisdom, each saying their god's influence had prevailed. But those who lived within the city knew that it was the blend, not the dominance of one vision, that gave them a life more balanced than most. In the quiet of their temples, perhaps even Enlil and Enki themselves looked upon this city and saw something rare, a reflection of their own divided yet intertwined natures, given form in brick and water, decree and dream. The myths also speak of times when the rivalry between the brothers spilled into the affairs of distant lands. Trade connected Sumer with places far beyond the two rivers, the mountains to the north, the deserts to the west, the coasts of the eastern sea. Caravans brought cedar wood, lapis lazuli, copper, and exotic animals, and with them came foreign rulers, eager to win the favor of the Sumerian gods. Some turned to Enlil, seeking the stability and legitimacy that his authority could grant. Others approached Enki, drawn to his gifts of technology, agriculture, and craft. One tale tells of a distant coastal king who suffered from poisoned wells. He sent emissaries to Nippur, offering gold and rare shells, asking Enlil to cleanse the waters. Enlil refused, declaring that the king's people must first atone for the disrespect they had shown to their local shrines. Frustrated, the emissaries traveled south to Eridu. Enki welcomed them, descending into the Abzu to draw forth a jar of pure water. He gave it to the emissaries with instructions for purifying the wells, and within days the coastal kingdom's thirst was ended. When word of this reached Nippur, Enlil did not reverse the healing, but chastised Enki in the assembly for undermining the principles of divine order. To Enlil, the act encouraged defiance of the god's justice. To Enki, it was justice. Why let people suffer when the means to help was at hand? The story was told for generations among traders who traveled the length of the rivers, each drawing their own lesson from it. Some saw Enki's act as proof that mercy should triumph over protocol. Others argued that Enlil's caution was necessary, for without respect for the sacred laws, chaos would erode the foundations of the world. But all agreed on one thing: the gods were not remote abstractions. They shaped the fate of cities and caravans, of kings and herdsmen alike, in decisions that reflected the same tensions and choices humans faced in their own lives. The rivalry found its way into the arts as well. In temple schools, apprentice scribes copied hymns praising both Enlil and Enki, learning not just the words, but the philosophies they carried. Hymns to Enlil spoke of steadfastness, the unshakable bond between heaven and earth, the unbending pillar of law. Hymns to Enki celebrated ingenuity, the playful turning of the mind, the hidden path that solves the unsolvable. These were not merely praises, they were teachings, shaping how young minds saw the world. Artisans, too, reflected the brothers' influence. Statues made for Nippur's sanctuaries were carved with precise lines and symmetrical forms, embodying the order Enlil valued. In Eridu, carvings often included flowing patterns of water, reeds, and fish, symbols of life's adaptability. When traveling festivals brought these works together, the contrast was striking, yet strangely harmonious. Like two modes of music that share the same scale. One particularly famous poem, found on clay tablets in both cities, tells of a contest between Enki and Enlil to see whose gifts were more vital. Enlil brought a great wind that cleared the air and drove the clouds to rain upon the fields, filling the granaries. Enki released the fresh waters of the Abzu, turning parched soil into lush gardens and reviving dying orchards. The poem ends without declaring a winner, instead describing how the rivers swelled under the rains and how the rains refreshed the springs, each gift enhancing the other. Scholars would later remark that this ending carried a truth deeper than simple victory or defeat, that the two powers, though often in tension, were interdependent in ways even they could not escape. And so, as the cities grew and the centuries passed, the people learned to navigate between the brothers' spheres. They made offerings in both temples, sang hymns to both gods, and built their lives in the fertile space between decree and creativity. The rivalry remained, but beneath it ran a current of mutual necessity, a recognition, perhaps unspoken, that the world was whole only when both mountain and water, law and wisdom, wind and spring played their part in its endless unfolding. As time moved forward, the myths began to intertwine the brothers' rivalry with the great cycles of history, the rise and fall of cities, the turning of ages. The scribes spoke of the tablets of destiny, sacred objects said to hold the decrees that governed the cosmos. In most accounts, these tablets rested in Enlil's keeping, symbolizing his ultimate authority over heaven and earth. Yet there were moments when the tablets passed briefly into other hands, and each time the world seemed to shift. One story tells of a cunning trick by which Enki, seeking to avert a crisis, temporarily claimed the tablets. A foreign army was marching toward Sumer, its leaders boasting they would seize Nippur itself. Enki, knowing that Enlil's wrath might lead to a war that would ravage the fertile lands, appeared in the assembly with a plan. If the tablets were placed under his guardianship for a time, he said, he could weave a spell that would turn the invaders back without bloodshed. Reluctantly, Enlil agreed. Enki worked through the night, summoning the spirits of river and reed, fish and bird, weaving illusions so vast that the invaders saw the land as a shifting maze of marshes and impassable channels. Confused and disheartened, they turned away. When the danger had passed, Enki returned the tablets without a word. In some versions, Enlil thanked him openly. In others, he merely accepted them with a nod, his pride unwilling to admit that his brother's methods had saved the land. Either way, the tale became a lesson in the paradox of authority, that sometimes, to preserve the order, one must momentarily surrender control. And it also became another thread in the tapestry of their relationship, showing that while rivalry often colored their dealings, it could also become the very tool by which Sumer endured. Another myth, older and more obscure, speaks of a council in which the gods debated the fate of the wild lands beyond the cities. Enlil argued that these lands should remain untouched, as boundaries marking the extent of human dominion. To expand into them, he warned, would disrupt the balance between the cultivated and the untamed, leading to chaos. Enki countered that the wild lands were a reservoir of resources and knowledge places where new plants could be found, where rivers might be diverted, where hidden ores could be mined. The debate raged for days, with other gods taking sides, farmers and hunters, listening to the echoes of the divine assembly in their own councils, saw the argument reflected in their own lives. Should they expand their fields into the marshes? Should they leave the forest edges untouched? In the myth's resolution, a compromise emerged. Certain lands would be left sacred and inviolate, while others could be explored under strict guidance. Enlil's boundaries were respected, but Enki's vision of expansion was given room to breathe. The story was told each year at a seasonal festival marking the balance between planting and fallow time, a reminder that not all ground must be cultivated, and not all boundaries are meant to remain forever. Over time, these myths served not just as entertainment or sacred lore, but as a kind of philosophy for living in a complex world. The rivalry between Enki and Enlil, far from being a simple feud, became a mirror in which the people of Sumer could see the tensions in their own choices: caution versus curiosity, preservation versus change. And in the ebb and flow of the rivers, in the seasons of planting and harvest, they saw the dance of the two brothers playing out endlessly, shaping not only the land, but the minds and hearts of those who called it home. The cycles of cooperation and conflict between the brothers found their sharpest edge during times of human rebellion. One such tale tells of a city whose king grew proud and sought to claim divinity for himself while still in the flesh. He ordered statues of his image to be placed in temples alongside the gods, and he decreed that offerings meant for Enlil and Enki should instead be brought first to his own altar. Enlil's reaction was immediate. He sent drought and windstorms, withering the crops and toppling the unfinished towers. To him, this was an affront to the order that separated mortal from divine, a breach that could not be ignored. Enki, however, saw another path. He entered the dreams of the king and showed him visions of the ancient days, when humans had been shaped from clay and divine essence. In these visions, the king saw himself as a child at the knees of the gods, learning the arts and crafts that had built his city. When the king awoke, he was humbled. He restored the offerings to the temples, pulled down the statues of himself, and dedicated new shrines to both brothers. Enlil lifted the drought, and the winds grew calm. The myth is told as a parable of mercy following discipline. Enlil's severity curbed the offense, but Enki's gentler guidance reformed the heart. It became a favorite tale among priests who sought to counsel rulers, for it showed that the gods themselves used more than one tool to shape the fate of kings. In later centuries, as Sumer wove itself into the broader empires of Akkad and Babylon, the stories of Enki and Enlil did not fade, they adapted. In Akkadian, Enki became Ea, and Enlil's authority was still recognized at Nippur. The Babylonian scribes recorded old Sumerian myths alongside new tales, blending them into a shared heritage. Yet even in this merging, the essence of their rivalry remained clear. One Babylonian version of the flood story adds a detail absent from the older Sumerian telling. It says that when Ea warned Utnapishtim to build the ark, he also gave him instructions for preserving the seeds of every plant known to man. This addition deepened the sense of Ea as the guardian of life's continuity, ensuring that the world could be replanted after the waters receded. Enlil's role remained as the enforcer of divine decrees, the one whose decision brought the flood, but also as the god who, after seeing the survivors, granted Utnapishtim and his wife a form of immortality. The pairing of destruction and preservation, judgment and renewal, continued to shape how the people of Mesopotamia understood the divine. They prayed to Enlil for the stability of their cities, for the protection of walls and fields against the chaos beyond. They prayed to Ea for the wisdom to adapt, for the skills to survive when stability was broken. In this way, the two brothers' influence became inseparable from the identity of the land itself, a dual current running beneath every ziggurat, every law code, every irrigation channel that crisscrossed the fertile plains. And so, even as empires rose and fell, and the language of the scribes shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian, the old rivalry endured not as a quarrel frozen in time, but as a living dialogue shaping the destiny of kings and the daily bread of farmers, whispering its lessons to each new generation in the voice of both wind and water. There is a quieter myth, rarely recited in grand festivals, that tells of a night when the brothers met not in the assembly of the gods, but alone on the banks of a moonlit canal. The land was at peace, the harvest stored, and the rivers full but gentle. Enlil had come south to inspect certain levees, and Enki met him there, emerging from the shadows, like the slow rise of mist from the water. They spoke not as rivals, but as siblings, remembering the earliest days. Enlil asked whether Enki ever tired of bending rules, of finding hidden doors in the walls of fate. Enki asked whether Enlil ever feared that his decrees might bind too tightly, cutting off life's ability to adapt. Neither tried to change the other's mind. They stood together, watching the reflection of the stars ripple in the water, and after a long silence, Enlil admitted that the canals Enki had designed years ago had saved thousands during the last drought. Enki, in turn, acknowledged that without Enlil's unyielding defense of the boundary stones, the peace between cities might have fractured long ago. The myth ends with the two brothers parting at dawn, each returning to his temple. It does not claim that they became friends without quarrel, nor that their rivalry ended. Instead, it leaves the image of two forces aware of their interdependence, knowing that their opposing currents both fed the same river of life. It was a story often told by elders to remind the young that disagreement need not mean enmity, and that strength can grow in the space between difference and unity. As the centuries drew on, the cults of Enki and Enlil faced the challenge of shifting political tides. Foreign rulers came to Sumer, some reverent toward the old gods, others eager to assert new deities. Yet the stories of the brothers adapted with each era, their themes of balance and rivalry finding new expressions. In some reigns, Enlil was emphasized as the supreme authority, the unshakable pillar of empire. In others, Enki's image as a cunning savior of mankind took precedence, especially in times of environmental hardship or social unrest. One recorded omen text from the later period describes a year of strange weather, winter rains failing, followed by an early flood that drowned young crops. The priests interpreted this as a sign that the brothers were in dispute. Public rites were held in both Nippur and Eridu, with envoys traveling between the cities carrying symbolic offerings. Jars of pure water for Enki, wreaths of mountain flowers for Enlil. By midsummer, the weather had normalized, and the event was recorded as the reconciliation of the two lords. Whether the change in weather was coincidence or the gods' response mattered little to the people. What endured was the conviction that harmony between Enki and Enlil meant harmony in the world. The rituals of dual offering became part of the seasonal cycle in several cities, and merchants began to keep small paired tokens, one carved of stone, the other of shell, as charms, to ensure both divine favor and adaptable fortune. Thus, even in the twilight of Sumer's independence, the brothers' rivalry continued to shape thought, practice, and belief. And though the physical power of their temples would eventually wane, their stories remained etched in clay and in memory, carried forward into the myths of later civilizations, where wind and water, law and wisdom, would always be told as two halves of a single unending tale. In the later Babylonian retellings, the rivalry between Enki and Enlil began to take on a cosmic dimension that reached beyond the cities and rivers of Mesopotamia. The scribes described the two as forces embedded in the very structure of the universe. Enlil as the fixed axis around which the heavens turned, Enki as the flowing current that wove through the foundations of the earth. In these versions, their disputes were not simply about kings or canals, but about the cycles of time itself. One such text speaks of the Great Measure, a divine calendar by which the ages of the world were set. Enlil's priests claimed that it was he who established the sequence of ages, determining when cities would rise, when floods would come, and when lands would rest. But Enki's followers countered that their lord had hidden within each age a seed of change, a way for life to adapt to whatever destiny decreed. The myths say that in every age, there comes a moment when Enlil's plan meets Enki's adaptation, and from that meeting, a new era is born. These cosmic retellings were often used to explain great transitions in history, the collapse of an empire, the founding of a new capital, even the shift from one language of administration to another. The people might not agree on which god's influence was greater in these changes, but they agreed that both were present. In the marketplace, this was expressed in a simple proverb: "The wind fills the sail, but the water carries the boat." It was a saying that honored both brothers without naming them, a quiet acknowledgement that neither force could be ignored if one hoped to reach safe harbor. Toward the final centuries of their great cities, as foreign powers pressed upon the Mesopotamian plains, the temples of Enki and Enlil stood as symbols of an older order. Pilgrims still came to Nippur to walk the courtyards of Ikur, where Enlil's presence was felt in the hush of the air and the shadow of massive walls. Others journeyed to Eridu, where the ruins of Abzu still echoed with the trickle of springs, and where the priests poured libations into the ground to honor the hidden waters. One last recorded myth from this era tells of a vision granted to a humble temple gardener. He dreamed of a tree whose roots were in the Abzu and whose branches touched the windswept heavens. In the dream, two figures tended the tree Enki at its roots, watering them with crystal streams, and Enlil among the branches, pruning them to keep their shape. When the gardener awoke, he told the priests, who recognized the vision as a final message to their generation. The strength of the tree came not from root or branch alone, but from both together. The story spread quickly, becoming a quiet anthem in the markets and the workshops. In a time when the political future was uncertain, it reminded the people that the essence of their world was older than any kingdom, that balance between stability and change, between wind and water, had shaped them from the first days. Even as new gods rose to prominence under foreign rule, the image of the two brothers tending the same tree endured. It was carved into seals, painted on pottery, and whispered in blessings full. As the empires shifted and new rulers stamped their marks upon the land, the figure of Enki began to blend with other water and wisdom deities, while Enlil's image sometimes merged with high gods of foreign pantheons. Yet in the private prayers of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, the brothers were still invoked by their old Sumerian names. Clay tablets from the final centuries show humble petitions a sailor asking Enki to calm the currents beneath his vessel, a magistrate seeking Enlil's guidance in rendering fair judgment. These were not grand political invocations, but everyday acts of devotion, proof that the old relationship between gods and mortals still flowed quietly beneath the official cults of empire. In one particularly moving hymn, a poet imagines the two brothers meeting at the edge of the sea at dawn. Enlil brings the steady breath of the wind to fill the sails of outbound ships, while Enki guides the channels so they may pass safely through the shallows. The poet praises them not for their rivalry, but for their shared guardianship over the journey. The hymn ends with a prayer that the winds of decree and the waters of wisdom remain in harmony for all who travel between distant shores. These quieter depictions suggest that, for the people who lived through uncertain times, the idea of Enki and Enlil as complementary forces was a source of comfort, whatever disputes the myths recorded. The enduring truth was that both brothers had a role in sustaining life. Even if their temples were diminished, their presence lingered in the wind on the canals and in the cool taste of well water on a hot day. Archaeologists in our own time have uncovered fragments that hint at myths now mostly lost tales, where Enki and Enlil face challenges from beyond the known world. In one, a serpent of the outer darkness threatens to coil around the earth itself. Enlil marshals the winds to hold it back, but its strength grows with each passing night. Enki, instead of attacking, sends messengers into the serpent's dreams, weaving visions of endless rivers and safe harbors until the creature turns its hunger toward the farthest edges of the sea. The story ends with the brothers standing together on a high mountain, watching the horizon clear. They do not speak, but the silence between them is heavy with mutual recognition. The scribes who recorded it may have intended it as an allegory for repelling foreign threats or overcoming disasters, but the heart of the myth is unmistakable, that there are moments when only the combined powers of stability and adaptability can preserve the world. In the dim light of fading empires, such stories carried a kind of hope. They reminded listeners that even in times of decline, the old forces still worked together when the stakes demanded it. Whether in the form of wind or water, decree or cunning, the balance between the brothers was not just a relic of the past, but a living principle, waiting to be called upon whenever the world trembled. In the final layers of their mythology, the brothers' rivalry came to be seen not as a conflict to be resolved, but as the very foundation of the world's endurance. Late hymns, from the era when Sumer had long been absorbed into other empires, portray Enki and Enlil as twin pillars, each leaning just enough toward the other to keep the roof of heaven from collapsing. Without Enlil's unyielding decrees, the order of seasons and the stability of kingship would crumble. Without Enki's flowing adaptability, life would wither when faced with drought, flood, or change. One of the last recorded myths tells of a symbolic trial in the court of the gods. The charge that humanity, though born of divine will, had strayed from the purpose for which it was created. The prosecutor was Enlil, arguing that mankind's defiance and noise threatened the harmony of the cosmos. The defender was Enki, speaking for humanity's resilience and capacity to learn. Each presented visions. Enlil showed the chaos of unchecked ambition, cities burning in their own greed. Enki showed the beauty of innovation, the laughter of children, the building of ships to cross unknown seas. The verdict was not a simple judgment. The assembly decreed that mankind would remain as it was, a creature of both obedience and curiosity, bound by laws yet free to dream. It was a decision that reflected both brothers equally, and it became a quiet myth, retold in the final gatherings of temple schools, reminding listeners that the human story was, in a sense, the mirror of the gods' own. As the centuries wore on, the great ziggurats of Nippur and Eridu fell into ruin. Sand and silt crept over courtyards, where priests had once sung hymns to the wind and the deep waters. Yet travelers and herders still knew the places. They spoke of the strange stillness in the air at Nippur, and of the sweet taste of water drawn from certain hidden springs near Eridu. These whispers kept the memory of the brothers alive, even as the cities faded from maps. In villages along the rivers, old storytellers continued to weave their rivalry into new tales. Enlil became the stern elder who guarded the grain stores against careless hands. Enki became the clever uncle who taught children how to find hidden fish pools in the marshes. The scale of the myths had grown smaller, but their essence remained. People still understood that life required both kinds of wisdom, the steadfast and the adaptable, the law that binds and the knowledge that frees. And so, while the monuments crumbled, the stories endured. They were passed from mouth to ear, from one generation to the next, until the names of the gods themselves were half forgotten. But the lessons they embodied still guided the daily choices of those who lived by the rhythm of the rivers. Today, when scholars unroll the fragile tablets and trace the wedge-shaped impressions left by hands thousands of years gone, the voices of Enki and Enlil speak again. They speak not only of ancient cities and divine assemblies, but of a truth that has outlived the empires of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and beyond. That creation and order are not enemies, but partners in the shaping of worlds. The rivalry of the brothers is no simple quarrel of pride. It is the tension that makes growth possible without chaos, and stability possible without stagnation. It is the reason that rivers can be both tamed and left to wander, that laws can stand firm, yet bend when mercy demands it. In the myths, their disagreements are never truly resolved, because the world itself depends on both remaining in play. In the silence of abandoned temples, in the patterns of irrigation canals still visible from the air, in the steady winds that ripple across marsh waters at dawn, the echo of their story remains. The people who first told it are gone, but their insight endures, that the fate of humanity is shaped by the meeting of two currents, one of decree, one of wisdom. And so, though the ziggurats have fallen, and the reeds have reclaimed the banks of the old canals, the spirit of Enki and Enlil flows on, in every choice between holding fast and letting go, in every balance struck between rule and renewal. Their tale is not only the story of gods and ancient Sumer, it is the story of the world itself, still unfolding beneath the same sky, and over the same deep waters that once bound two brothers in rivalry and in an unbreakable bond. The rivers of Sumer have long since shifted their courses. The temples of Nippur and Eridu stand in silent ruins, and yet the story of Enki and Enlil still flows through time. It lives in every decision, to hold firm or to yield, in every moment when law and mercy meet. The people who once called upon these gods have gone, but the lessons remain, that creation and order are not enemies, but companions on the same eternal journey. As the winds fade and the waters grow still, may their ancient balance remind us that the world is shaped not only by the power to command, but by the wisdom to adapt, and in that balance, we too may find our place beneath the endless sky.